They called her the ghost of the quarry, a whisper that clung to the high-altitude dust of forward operating base Kestrel's perch. They said she could listen to the bones of the earth and predict their fevers. In the sterile, data-driven world of modern warfare, she was an anomaly, a creature of intuition and deep, archaic science. Major Thorne, a man forged in the simple certainties of ordnance and attrition, called her a civilian contractor, a liability, a name on a manifest he had not approved. He learned in the span of a single, catastrophic hour that the mountain had a voice, and she was its tongue. He learned that some things cannot be broken by force, only by understanding. And he learned that the most devastating blow is not delivered by a fist, but by a truth so absolute it shatters the world you thought you knew. The air at Kestrel's perch was a thin, sharp thing, tasting of metal and cold stone. It was a currency you spent with every breath, a constant tax on the body for the privilege of occupying this God's forsaken shard of the planet. The base was less a construction and more a scar gouged into the granite shoulder of a mountain that cared little for the transient affairs of men. Prefabricated habitation units and command modules were bolted directly to the rock, their lines stark and artificial against the chaotic geometry of the peaks. A constant low-frequency hum permeated everything, the thrum of life support, the whine of servers, the distant growl of the perimeter's automated defense systems. It was a sound that worked its way into your bones, a mechanical heartbeat against the profound geological silence of the range. The silence was the real enemy. It was a coiled thing, waiting. Dr. Eris Thorne did not notice the hum, or rather, she had cataloged it, analyzed its spectral signature, and filed it away as baseline noise within the first 5 minutes of her arrival. Now, it was simply part of the ambient data stream she perpetually filtered. She occupied a space that was not quite a room. It was a repurposed server closet at the back of the Combat Information Center, a space Thorne's logistics officer had grudgingly cleared for the geological survey specialist. Her designation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. The closet smelled of ozone and hot electronics, a dry, sterile scent that she preferred to the sweat and nervous energy of the main CIC floor. Her domain was a cramped alcove filled with equipment that looked alien to the uniformed soldiers who occasionally glanced in. There was no rifle rack, no body armor. Instead, there were spectrum analyzers, custom-built seismographs with impossibly sensitive piezoelectric sensors, and a central processing unit that vented a shimmering wave of heat into the small space. Her world was rendered in waterfalls of cascading data, in the jagged peaks of Fourier transforms, and in the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of a needle on a drum graph. She was tracing an anomaly. For 3 days, a ghost had haunted her sensors. It was a whisper of energy, too structured for natural seismic activity, too faint for conventional subterranean drilling. It was a repeating pattern, a coded pulse of infrasound that vibrated up through the bedrock. It was a question asked of the mountain itself. Eris was a small woman with a frame that seemed too slight to contain the immense gravity of her focus. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. Her face, devoid of makeup or expression, was illuminated by the cool green light of her primary monitor. Her fingers moved across a keyboard, not with the frantic tap of a comms tech, but with the slow, deliberate precision of a concert pianist. She was listening, not with her ears, but with a network of sensors she had spent a week embedding into the mountain's deepest fissures, miles from the base. She was listening to the planet's crust, and it was telling her a story she did not like. The doors to the CIC hissed open, and a wave of sound and presence washed over the room. Major Kent Thorne. He did not walk. He occupied space. He was a large man, his physical bulk amplified by the crisp lines of his uniform and the unyielding certainty of his posture. His voice was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer home commands, not to invite discussion. He moved through the CIC like a proprietary system checking its nodes, his eyes scanning every screen, his presence demanding and receiving immediate deference. The low chatter of the room ceased, replaced by the clipped, formal cadence of status reports. Intel, give me a sitrep on the Eastern Ridge. I want to know why Patrol Bravo missed their check-in, Thorne boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged module. A young lieutenant snapped to attention. Sir, we've lost comms with Bravo. We believe it's atmospheric interference from the ionospheric scattering. Atmospheric interference, Thorne repeated, the words dripping with contempt. He jabbed a thick finger at a topographical map on the main screen. The enemy is using jammers. They're testing our response time. I want a drone sweep of Sector Gamma 7, full thermal and electronic warfare package. Find the source and task an artillery solution. Now. His orders were clean, direct, and predicated on a world view where every problem had a corresponding ordinance. He operated on the principle of overwhelming force. It was a philosophy that had served him well in the deserts and jungles of previous deployments. Here, in the vertical world of the Kestrel Range, it was a language the mountains did not speak. His sweep of the room brought him to the alcove. He stopped, his momentum broken by the sight of the woman and her strange, silent machines. He had seen her before, a fleeting shape in the mess hall, always alone, always seemingly lost in thought. He had dismissed her as one of the civilian support staff, an egghead from some university contract. Seeing her here, inside the nerve center of his command, was a different matter entirely. It was a violation of the sanctum. He strode over, his shadow falling across her monitors. Eris did not look up. Her focus was absolute, locked on a new signal that had just bloomed on her screen, a harmonic of the first anomaly, clearer, stronger, a response to the question that had been asked. "Who in the hell are you?" Thorne's voice was low, a controlled growl that was more menacing than his public boom. Eris completed a command sequence, saving the data stream before she finally turned her head. Her eyes, a pale, dispassionate gray, met his. There was no surprise in them, no fear. It was the gaze of a scientist observing a new, loud, and potentially disruptive variable. "My designation is Dr. Eris Thorne," she stated, her voice quiet and level, a stark contrast to his. She used her full name and title, a rare and deliberate act. Thorne's face darkened at the shared surname, a cosmic insult he couldn't immediately process. "I don't care what your name is. I care what you're doing in my CIC. This is a restricted area." "I am monitoring subsurface resonance patterns," she replied, the sentence as clean and sterile as her lab environment. He glanced at her screens, a chaotic jumble of lines and numbers to his untrained eye. It looked like nonsense, the digital doodling of a bored technician. "Subsurface resonance," he scoffed. "We are in a war zone, Doctor. We are tracking enemy positions and coordinating live fire missions. We are not conducting a geological survey. Whatever this science project is, pack it up. I want you and your gear out of here in 10 minutes. It was the punch. It was the dismissal of her entire world, the reduction of her life's work to a science project. It was a declaration that her reality was irrelevant in the face of his. Eris turned back to her monitor, her attention already pulled away by a fresh cascade of data. The resonance pattern was stabilizing, locking into a terrifyingly pure frequency. The enemy wasn't just probing anymore. They were tuning. "That will not be possible, Major," she said, her voice still quiet, but now edged with a fine, hard certainty. "My work is mission critical." Thorne's face contorted with a flash of pure fury, the sheer audacity of the woman, the quiet, unshakable defiance, was more infuriating than a shouted argument. He was used to subordinates who snapped to attention, who obeyed without question. He was not used to being treated as a secondary concern. "Mission critical? You are a civilian contractor attached to a support element. The only thing critical for you is to follow the orders of the military commander of this facility." "Sergeant!" he bellowed, turning to the nearest non-com, a communications specialist named Reyes, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. "Sergeant Reyes, escort this woman and her equipment to the non-essential personnel barracks. Now." Sergeant Reyes, a sharp, competent man who had earned his stripes by knowing which orders to follow instantly and which to question discreetly, hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had seen the doctor work. He had seen the strange, intricate wiring she had run, connecting her alcove to the base's primary comms antenna and the deep ground sensors. He had a technician's respect for complex systems, and he recognized a master of one when he saw her. But an order was an order, especially one delivered with such venom. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice flat. He took a step toward the alcove. "Major," Eris said, her voice cutting through the tension, still without looking at him. "The resonant frequency the enemy is targeting is 7.38 Hertz. It is the primary resonant frequency of the granite batholith this base is built upon. If they achieve full sympathetic resonance, the structural integrity of this entire mountain will be compromised. Your patrols are not missing check-ins because of jamming. They are likely already dead, victims of localized rock slides triggered by the initial probes." Silence. The data on her screen was no longer just lines. It was a death sentence, written in the language of physics. The information was stark, clinical, and utterly terrifying. Thorne stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. It ran counter to everything he knew. War was fought with bullets and bombs, not with hertz and harmonics. It was a trick, a pathetic attempt by a civilian to justify her presence, to sound important. "That is the most absurd thing I have ever heard," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You are relieved of your duties, Doctor. Reyes, get her out of my sight before I have her arrested for insubordination and interfering with military operations." Reyes moved, his hand reaching for Eris's arm. And then it began. It was not a sound, not at first. It was a feeling. A deep, gut-wrenching vibration that rose up from the floor, through the soles of their boots, and into the base of their skulls. It was a pressure in the inner ear, a dizzying sense of vertigo. Coffee cups on desks began to tremble, rattling in their saucers. The lights flickered, a brief, violent stutter. On the main CIC screen, the drone feed from Sector Gamma 7 dissolved into a blizzard of static. "What was that?" Thorne demanded, grabbing the edge of a console to steady himself. "Seismic event? An earthquake?" "No," Eris said, her voice a cold, steady anchor in the rising sea of confusion. Her eyes were fixed on her monitor, where a single, perfect sine wave now dominated the display. It was beautiful in its lethality. That was the tuning fork. The concert has begun. The vibration intensified. The low-frequency hum now audible, a monstrous groan that seemed to emanate from the very rock around them. A fine dust began to sift down from the ceiling panels. A hairline crack appeared on the reinforced playscreen wall behind the main screen, branching out like a bolt of black lightning. The men and women in the CIC exchanged panicked glances. This was not an artillery barrage. This was not an airstrike. This was something alien, something fundamental. The very ground beneath their feet had become the weapon. Thorne's training kicked in, a rigid protocol for a situation that had no protocol. "Damage control teams, report," he yelled, his voice straining to be heard over the growing din. "Get me a link to Wing Command. Tell them we are under attack by an unknown weapon type. I want every sensor we have pointed at that ridge." He was shouting into a storm, his commands swallowed by the rising tide of chaos. The communications were dead. The drone was gone. His eyes, the tools of his trade, were blind. He turned back to Eris. She was a statue of calm amidst the pandemonium. Her hands were flying across her keyboard, her face bathed in the glow of her screens. She wasn't panicking. She was working. She was analyzing the attack, deconstructing it into its component parts, her mind moving at the speed of light and logic. In that moment, Thorne felt a sliver of something he had not felt since his first day of basic training. The cold, nauseating touch of genuine fear. His world of simple, violent certainties was dissolving around him, and the only person who seemed to understand why was the small, quiet woman he had just tried to throw out. The bass screamed. It was a high-pitched shriek of stressed metal as a support beam in the ceiling began to buckle. A bank of servers toppled over with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks across the floor. The lights went out, plunging the CIC into a terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the emergency strobes and the unwavering green glow from Eris's alcove. The groaning of the mountain grew louder, deeper, the sound of a giant stirring in its sleep. Thorne's authority, so absolute moments before, had evaporated. His orders were meaningless. His men were looking at him, their faces masks of terror, searching for an answer he did not have. He was a king whose castle was being dismantled from its very foundations. He had brute force, but the enemy was not a target to be shelled. It was a frequency. It was an idea. How do you shoot an idea? Through the strobing darkness, he saw Reyes. The sergeant was no longer standing by the alcove, waiting to carry out his order. He was standing beside Aris, his face grim, his eyes fixed on her screen as if it were the only scripture that mattered. He was pointing at a flashing icon. "Ma'am," Reyes's voice was tight but clear over the cacophony. "The LRADs are still on the internal power grid. I can give you control, but the network is unstable. Long-range acoustic devices, crowd control weapons, sonic cannons." Thorne had dismissed them as glorified loudspeakers, useless in a real fight. Aris nodded, not taking her eyes off the screen. "I don't need the network. I need a direct physical patch. Get me a hard line to the emitter's primary frequency generators. And I need the schematics for the seismic charges we used for the foundation pylons. The detonation primers." Thorne's mind reeled. LRADs and construction explosives. It was madness. "What are you doing?" he managed to yell, stumbling towards her alcove. "You'll bring the whole mountain down on our heads." She finally turned to look at him. The emergency lights cast stark shadows across her face. making her eyes seem like dark, hollow pits. There was no emotion in them, no triumph, no fear, not even contempt. There was only the cold, hard calculus of necessity. "The mountain is already coming down, Major," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "I am merely choosing the manner of its descent. You have lost control of the situation. Your methods have failed. Your authority is now a liability to the survival of every person on this base." "Sergeant Reyes," she said, her gaze shifting to the man beside her, "I am assuming operational command of this facility under the Emergency Protocol for Existential Threats, Codex Chimera. You will follow my orders without question. Is that understood?" There was a moment of absolute stillness in the heart of the chaos. Thorne stared, dumbfounded. Emergency Protocol Chimera? He'd never heard of it. It sounded like something she had just invented. It was the ultimate act of insubordination, a seizure of command. He opened his mouth to scream, to order her arrest, to reassert the crumbling edifice of his rank, but the words died in his throat. Reyes, without a moment's hesitation, looked from Eris's unblinking eyes to Thorne's contorted face. He saw the difference between a solution and a dead end. He made his choice. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound certainty. He turned to his console. "Patching you into the LRAD frequency generators now. Schematics for the seismic charges are coming up on your secondary display." It was over. The transfer of power was complete. It had not been a vote or a coup. It was a simple, brutal law of nature. In a crisis, authority flows not to the one with the rank, but to the one with the answer. In the strobing, screaming darkness of the dying base, Major Thorne became irrelevant. The ghost had taken the helm. The world had narrowed to the small, glowing space of Eris's alcove. The groaning of the mountain was the canvas upon which she would now paint her solution. Her mind was a place of cold, silent clarity. She saw the problem not as chaos, but as a system of interlocking equations. The enemy was applying a specific energy at a specific frequency, 7.38 Hertz, to a resonant body, the granite batholith. The result was constructive interference, each wave of energy adding to the last, amplifying the vibration exponentially. It was an elegant, brutal piece of physics. Her solution, therefore, could not be to stop the energy. That was impossible. Her solution had to be to introduce a new energy source, precisely out of phase, to create destructive interference, to use the mountain's own resonant properties to cancel out the attack. It was like fighting a fire with a controlled backburn, only her fuel was tectonic stress, and her spark was a series of precisely timed sonic and seismic shocks. "Reyes," she said, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the shrieking of stressed metal around them. "I need you to slave the 3 primary LRAD emitters to my console. Emitter 1 is on the northern perimeter, correct? Pointed at the pass?" "Correct, ma'am," Reyes answered, his fingers flying across his own keyboard, his face a mask of concentration. He was no longer just a comms tech. He was the first acolyte of a new and terrifying faith. "Emitter 1 is slaved. Set its frequency to 14.76 Hertz, exactly 1 octave above the hostile frequency. I want a square wave pulse, not a sine wave, and I need the amplitude modulated according to the algorithm I'm sending you now." She didn't wait for his confirmation. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead. The square wave, with its built-in harmonics, would be more disruptive to the enemy's pure sine wave. The modulated amplitude would prevent the LRAD's energy from simply adding to the chaos, instead creating a stutter in the resonance. Emitter 2 on the western face, she continued, her eyes scanning the seismic charge schematics. The charges were standard issue, designed for blasting rock, not for delicate acoustic work. She would have to be precise. Tune it to 3.69 Hz, 1 octave below. Sine wave, continuous broadcast. It will act as a dampening field, absorbing some of the ambient energy. Thorne watched, his mouth agape. He felt like a primitive man watching a god assemble a chariot from lightning and thunder. He understood the words, hertz, amplitude, octave, but the grammar was alien. It was a language of creation and destruction he could not comprehend. He had tried to solve the problem by shooting at the shadow on the wall. She was rewriting the laws of light that cast it. The seismic charges, she said, her focus now absolute. There are 12 foundation pylons. I need charges placed on pylons 3, 7, and 11. The placement must be exact. I'm uploading the coordinates now. They must be detonated in a precise sequence, timed to the microsecond. Who is the head of your engineering and demolition team? That would be Gunnery Sergeant Cobb, ma'am, Reyes supplied. He's in the lower levels, trying to reinforce the primary supports. Get him on a hard line, now. A moment later, a panicked, breathless voice crackled over the local comm. This is Cobb. What the hell is going on up there? The whole damn world is coming apart. Gunnery Sergeant, Aris's voice was utterly devoid of emotion, a pure conduit of information. This is Dr. Thorne. You are about to receive coordinates for the placement of 3 seismic charges. You will place them exactly as specified. You will then slave their detonation primers to my mark. Your team has 7 minutes. 7 minutes? Ma'am, with all due respect, it's a goddamn earthquake down here. My men can barely stand. The shaking will only get worse, Gunnery Sergeant, Aris stated, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. If you do not place those charges as instructed, this base and everyone in it will cease to exist in approximately 9 minutes. The choice is yours. 7 minutes. The line was silent for a heartbeat. Then Cobb's voice returned, stripped of its panic and filled with a grim resolve. Coordinates received. We're moving. The next 7 minutes were an eternity stretched on the rack of the mountain's agony. The vibration reached a fever pitch. A section of the CIC's outer wall tore away with a deafening roar, exposing the screaming night-black sky and the jagged silhouette of the opposite peak. Wind and ice crystals blasted into the room, men and women huddled behind consoles, their faces pale with terror. Thorne was on the floor, clinging to the leg of a bolted-down table, his bravado shattered, reduced to a primal fear. He was no longer a major. He was just a man waiting to die. Only Aris seemed immune. She stood in her alcove, one hand braced against a rack of her own equipment, the other moving with uncanny steadiness across her controls. On her main screen, 3 new icons blinked into existence. Cobb's charges were in place. Cobb, report, she said into her microphone. Charges set, ma'am, the voice came back, strained and panting. We're clear of the blast zones, barely. Acknowledged, Aris said. She looked at Reyes. Emitters 1 and 2 are broadcasting? Broadcasting at full power, ma'am. Frequencies are holding steady. Good, she took a deep breath, the first sign of tension she had shown. Her eyes were locked on a complex waveform display. It showed the enemy's 7.38 Hz sine wave, a perfect, deadly rhythm. Superimposed on it were the chaotic, disruptive patterns from her LRADs. And at the bottom, a countdown timer linked to the seismic charges. This was the moment of truth. Her plan was based on a complex model of the mountain's internal structure, a structure she had only mapped with remote sensors. If her model was even a fraction of a degree off, her intervention would fail. Worse, it could amplify the resonance in an unforeseen way, turning a controlled demolition into an instantaneous, catastrophic collapse. She was targeting a specific geological feature she had identified deep beneath the base, a massive, unstable formation of crystalline quartz, a geode the size of a building. Her theory was that this formation was acting as a natural amplifier for the enemy's attack. The LRADs were meant to disrupt the resonance field around it, to shield the rest of the batholith. The seismic charges were the kill stroke. They were not aimed at the enemy. They were aimed at the quartz formation. She was not going to stop the vibration. She was going to give it a new, more attractive place to go. She was going to shatter the amplifier, creating a chaotic resonance sink, a black hole for sound that would absorb the enemy's energy in a feedback loop of self-destruction. "Detonation sequence initiated," she announced to the room, her voice the calm center of the hurricane. "On my mark." The countdown timer on her screen reached 10 seconds. 9! The mountain shuddered violently, throwing a technician from his chair. 8! Thorne squeezed his eyes shut. He began to pray. 7! Eris's fingers danced over her controls, making a final, infinitesimal adjustment to the phase alignment of emitter 1. 6! The enemy frequency on her screen spiked in amplitude. They knew something was happening. They were pushing more power. 5! She watched the numbers, her expression unreadable. 4! A profound, bone-jarring tremor shook the entire peak, as if the mountain itself was drawing a final ragged breath. 3, 2, 1, mark. She pressed the key. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, the floor dropped out from under them. It was not a vibration. It was a lurch, a sickening plunge of several feet as the seismic charges detonated miles below. The sound was not a bang, but a deep, resonant thump that was felt more than heard, a punch to the very soul of the rock. The shaking became apocalyptic. The single groaning note of the enemy's attack was replaced by a cacophony of grinding, shattering rock. The remaining lights in the CIC exploded in a shower of sparks. The entire structure of Kestrel's perch screamed in its death throes. Thorne was certain he was dead. This was it. She had failed. She had killed them all. He screamed, a raw, wordless cry of absolute terror that was swallowed by the roaring chaos. And then, silence. It was not a gradual quieting. It was instantaneous. One moment, the world was ending in a symphony of destruction. The next, there was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical presence. The roaring, the grinding, the vibrating, all of it vanished. Gone. The only sounds were the frantic gasping of the crew, the distant howl of the wind through the new hole in the wall, and the quiet, steady hum of Eris's equipment. Slowly, men and women pushed themselves up from the floor. They looked at each other, their faces etched with disbelief. They were alive. The mountain was still. Thorne pushed himself to his knees, his ears ringing in the sudden quiet. He looked at the alcove. Eris stood exactly as she had before, her face illuminated by the green glow of her monitor. On the screen, the perfect, deadly sine wave of the enemy's attack was gone. In its place was a chaotic, decaying waveform, a flatlining EKG. She had done it. She hadn't just weathered the storm, she had unmade it. The silence in the CIC stretched for a full minute, a period of collective rebirth. It was broken by a new sound, a crisp electronic chirp from the main communications console, which had just rebooted on emergency power. A single secure channel was open. A green light blinked insistently. Sergeant Reyes, his face pale but his hands steady, moved to the console. He pressed the button. "Kestrel's perch, go ahead," he said, his voice hoarse. A voice came through the speaker, calm, clear, and radiating an authority that dwarfed even Thorne's at his most bombastic. "Perch Command, this is Colonel Vance. Project Oversight. Report." Thorne scrambled to his feet, his training reasserting itself, his mind desperately trying to reclaim the narrative. This was his chance to salvage something from the wreckage of his command. "Colonel," he barked, striding toward the console, shoving Reyes aside. "Major Thorne reporting. We were hit, sir. A new form of seismic weapon. We sustained heavy damage, but the threat has been neutralized. I took decisive action." The voice on the other end was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, it was laced with a cold, dangerous quiet. "Major Thorne, your decisive action consisted of attempting to shell a ghost and then ordering the removal of the one person on that mountain who could save you. Is that an accurate summary?" Thorne froze, his blood turning to ice water. Vance knew. He had been watching, listening, the entire time. "Sir, the civilian contractor. She acted outside the chain of command." "Dr. Aris is not a contractor, Major," the colonel's voice cut in, sharp as broken glass. "And she is not a civilian. She is the lead scientist and architect of Project Chimera. Her authority on any matter related to the Kestrel defense system, which, for your information, is the mountain itself, supersedes all local military command. That is written in your operational briefing, Section 12, subsection Gamma, a section you clearly did not read. Thorne's world, which had just been shattered and reassembled, shattered again. Project Chimera. He remembered the file now. A heavily redacted document about environmental defense integration. He had dismissed it as technical nonsense, irrelevant to the real business of fighting. "The weapon you faced was a test, Major," Vance continued, his voice a whip crack. "A test of our new defensive paradigm, and a test of the command structure's ability to adapt to it. Dr. Aris was there to observe, and, if necessary, to intervene. You, Major, were the control group, the variable representing outdated, rigid thinking. And you failed, spectacularly. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Thorne's career. He stood, exposed and humiliated, in the center of the room, the eyes of his former subordinates burning into him. They had all heard. They all knew. "Sir," Thorne began, his voice a pathetic whisper. "You are relieved of command, Major," Vance stated, the words final and absolute. "Effective immediately. Sergeant Reyes will assume temporary command of the facility until your replacement arrives. You will pack your personal effects and await transport. You will not speak to any member of the crew. You will not touch any piece of equipment. You are a ghost, Major. The only difference is, everyone can see you. Vance out." The connection died, leaving a silence even more profound than the one that had followed the attack. Thorne stood motionless for a full 10 seconds, his face a mask of utter ruin. Then, without a word, he turned and walked stiffly toward the exit, his back ramrod straight, a parody of the authority he no longer possessed. The doors hissed shut behind him, and he was gone. A new order had been born in the crucible of the crisis. The CIC was a wreck, but it was functional. The crew, led by Reyes, began the methodical work of damage assessment and repair. They moved with a quiet, focused efficiency they had never possessed under Thorne's loud command. Their movements were different around the alcove. They gave it a wide berth, as if it were a holy site. They spoke in hushed tones when they had to pass it. They looked at the small woman inside, not with fear, but with a deep and abiding awe. She was no longer the strange data clerk. She was the architect, the savior. Eris, for her part, had already returned to her work. The crisis was over. The data remained. She was cataloging the aftershocks, analyzing the decay of the resonance feedback loop she had created, comparing the real-world results to her theoretical models. Her victory brought her no pleasure. It was simply the successful conclusion of an experiment. The humiliation of Thorne was an irrelevant byproduct, a footnote in her report. An hour later, Sergeant Reyes approached the alcove. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He stood for a moment, watching her, unsure how to begin. She did not seem to notice him. Finally, he cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am." Eris finished typing a line of code, then turned her head slightly. "Sergeant," Reyes held out one of the mugs. "Thought you might need this." She looked at the mug, then at his face. Her pale gray eyes seemed to see right through him, analyzing his motives, his intent. After a moment, she took the mug, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was cool and dry. "Thank you, Sergeant." He didn't leave. He lingered, shifting his weight. He wasn't there just to offer coffee. He was there as a pilgrim. "The counter-resonance," he began, his voice quiet, respectful. "The destructive interference. I understand the principle, but the timing, the phase shift with the seismic charges, you were calculating it in real time against an amplifying energy source. The math, it seems impossible. How did you know the precise moment to detonate? How did you know it would create a sink and not just another shock wave?" It was the perfect question. He wasn't praising her. He wasn't thanking her. He was trying to understand. He was acknowledging her mastery by seeking to learn from it. Eris took a slow sip of the coffee. She turned her chair to face him more fully, a small but significant gesture. "The mountain isn't a single solid object," she began, her voice taking on the quality of a lecturer, but without the condescension. "It's a collection of faults, strata, and resonant bodies. I wasn't just listening to the enemy's attack. I was listening to the mountain's response. Every vibration, every tremor was a piece of information. The quartz formation, it had a unique echo. When the enemy's frequency hit it, the return signal had a slight phase distortion, a signature. I didn't calculate the solution from scratch. I merely amplified the mountain's own immune response." She turned back to her screen and pointed at a complex looping graph. "I let the mountain tell me where to cut." Reyes stared at the graph, then back at her face. He didn't fully understand, but he understood the core of it. She hadn't imposed her will on the mountain. She had collaborated with it. She had spoken its language. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. He backed away slowly and returned to his post, a changed man. 2 days later, a heavy transport chopper descended through the thin, cold air, its rotors beating a powerful rhythm against the silence of the peaks. Kestrel's Perch was a hive of quiet activity. The hole in the CIC wall was patched with a temporary seal. Comms were restored. The base was wounded but alive, breathing with a new, more resilient spirit. Eris packed her equipment. Her custom seismographs and analyzers were carefully placed back into their shockproof cases. Her entire world, a universe of data and terrible understanding, fit into 3 unassuming gray boxes. She wore the same simple functional fatigues she had arrived in. No one came to see her off. There was no ceremony, no farewell. It would have felt inappropriate, like trying to thank a force of nature. They simply watched her from a distance, from the windows of the CIC and the walkways of the base, as she walked across the landing pad, a small, solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the mountains she had tamed. As she boarded the chopper, she paused and looked back at the base, at the raw rock of the peak. Her face was, as always, a mask of calm neutrality. But for a fleeting instant, a flicker of something passed through her eyes. Not pride, not sadness, but a kind of deep, lonely kinship with the stone. She had listened to its secrets, felt its pain, and spoken on its behalf. The chopper lifted off, its sound fading into the vastness of the sky, leaving the mountain to its ancient silence. She left behind more than just a saved facility. She left behind a legend. They no longer called her the ghost of the quarry. They had a new name for her, spoken only in whispers in the quiet hours of the night shift. They called her Chimera, a testament to the idea that the most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that understands the silence. And for the men and women of Kestrel's Perch, the memory of her quiet competence became a new article of faith, a reminder that in the face of the unknown, true authority belongs not to the man who shouts the loudest, but to the one who listens the hardest to the bones of the earth.